What about the other part of the story that David Cameron was telling in that opening quote? Well, that's around the politics of what the government wants to achieve and the vision and the inspiration that is behind the coalition government. One thing on the coalition government, I mean, I think it came as a surprise to people in central government that a coalition was formed in the first instance, and secondly, that it was so strong. But our estimation is that the coalition government is here to stay. It's here for 5 years. And what that means is that it's possible to do some longer-term planning at the moment than it has been in the past, I think, strangely, because although the last government was here for 5 years, it still felt pretty unstable in terms of the internal politics within the Labour Party. The coalition, in a strange way, is both stronger and more stable than the previous administration. Say that again?
We'll see.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, we will see. We'll see how it pans out. But that's my view anyway. In terms of what the government thinks, there's plenty of sources you can look to. I put these on the board because they're all relevant to my department. We have Greg Clark, a Minister of State, who looks after decentralisation and the big society for CLG, and he wrote Total Politics about 8 years ago, which is a strong position on downsizing central government and devolving power to institutions at local level. And the big society itself, the publication before the election, and various other pre-election publications. And then this story has unfolded since the election in the various policy announcements that the government has made, the coalition programme itself setting out in great detail what the coalition aims to achieve, and then fleshing out the detail in stuff like the police white paper and the NHS white paper. So the sort of the programme of the government is coming clearer all the time. How do we understand, make sense of the plethora of initiatives that are coming out from central government? Well, my Secretary of State, Eric Pickles, said this just before the summer. If you want people to feel connected to their communities, proud of their communities, then you give people a real say over what happens in their communities, and the people and the power to make a difference. Because we like the folks, he says it in a Yorkshire accent. We don't think we know better than they do, and we trust them to know what's best for them. So we are determined to wrest control from the bureaucrats, the quangos, and central government departments, taking power and pushing it as far away from Whitehall as possible. And I want you to understand I'm deadly serious about this. And his seriousness has been seen in a series of announcements around the dissolution of the government officers, dissolution of the RDAs, the abolition of the Audit Commission, and so on. All of these are acts which remove bureaucratic power from central government by removing our mechanisms of control of what happens at local level. How do you understand and explain the big society and the government's programme for change? I think it's very important to get a grip on the idea that the big society is the outcome that the government wants to achieve. And it is an outcome which really is about changing the way we govern our country, changing the balance of power, giving people more of a voice and more of a say, giving people more of a sense of freedom and responsibility over what happens in their lives, getting rid of the idea that it's always the fault of them, whoever they are, the bureaucrats who, like myself, who run the system, and giving more influence and decision-making power to the people whose lives it affects. That is informed by the values of the coalition government, freedom, fairness, and responsibility. They sound like motherhood and apple pie, but they're not liberty, equality, and fraternity. I mean, words mean something, and these are the values of the coalition. What David Cameron said in Liverpool was that there are certain principles which govern the delivery of the big society, And what I would say, these principles are around what we can do for each other collectively, as communities, as families, I guess, as neighbourhoods, what we can do for our fellow citizen through philanthropic action and voluntary action to help other people, and what the state should do in order to help society work better. And, you know, activity, I think, can be broken down according to those three strands or principles of operation. And then he said there were three means or methods for delivering the big society that government pursues. And these three means are decentralisation, pushing power away from Whitehall and Westminster, transparency, making it much more transparent for everybody what the government is doing at whatever level, and providing finance, the right kind of finance in the right place with decision-making at the right level for that finance to make the best possible difference so that money is used as effectively as possible. How do you think of some of the different initiatives which the government has already launched and announced that contribute towards the big society? Here's a way of thinking about it, what I would call, break it down in four ways. First, which I would call sort of decentralized centralization. Centralized decentralization. Or do I mean decentralized centralization? Centralized decentralization, where the government says that you have to do something in order to decentralize. And a good example of that would be getting rid of PCTs and the creation of GP commissioning consortia at a lower level than the PCT level. So maybe it'd be 500 GP commissioning consortia against 137 PCTs that exist at the moment. Or elected police commissioners, taking democratic accountability out of the hands just of the Home Secretary and giving it to elected police chiefs in the 46 police authorities. So you're decentralising democratic accountability there. What I would call bottom-up decentralisation, where there is a demand coming from below for something to change. And so the New Deal for the Mayor of London is a good example of that, where the Mayor has come to the government and said, I would like some more powers, and the government listens to what is said and says, okay, these are the powers that we will give to you. And I guess an example of that at a lower level would be community-based budgeting, where a decision is given to local people as to how money should be spent locally. A fourth way is what I'd call liberalised decentralisation, which is where the government says something has to decentralise, but it's up to you how to do it. And local economic partnerships are a good example of that. I know a lot of you have been talking about that the last couple of days, where the government has said we're getting rid of our RDAs, we want a more local economic development system, but it's up to you to come forward and tell us how you want to do it. And planning reform, I think, as it comes out of the mist, will be in the same sort of model as that. And lastly, I'd call it creative decentralisation, or a rights-based agenda, where citizens, communities have a right to something to take control if they wish to do so. And free schools would be a good example of that, or the community right to bid, the community right to buy. And we're thinking about how the rights agenda might apply at community levels, so that if a community feels that it is ready to take more responsibility, how can it claim that responsibility and take some decision-making powers on for itself? There's also, of course, a wider sort of agenda for delivering a big society, which is kind of based on sort of community-type activities and organisations, which I'm sure is much more sort of familiar to you, and what is generally seen as being the big society. What I'm trying to say is that the big society isn't just the voluntary and community sector. It's a much bigger idea than that, but there are lots of ideas which aim specifically at helping communities and the VCS, and these are, some of them are listed here. And they're set out in the coalition agreement on the big society. You can look it up on the Cabinet Office website. There's 14 points there. So what do I think the issues for sort of discussion are in the light of that agenda? I mean, firstly, I think there is a very, very strong commitment from government to this idea called the big society. Secondly, I think there's a very strong commitment to a greater diversity of supply, an ending of monopolies, whether they are a Whitehall monopoly or a local government monopoly or a PCT monopoly, and the introduction of more participants in the provision of public services. A very strong commitment to decentralisation and localism at the heart of delivering the big society. A change in the balance of power, which you're already seeing, the abolition of things like the Audit Commission, which previously have been extremely powerful organisations. And of course, reductions in government spending, which is a challenge which everyone is focusing on at the moment because where we are in the cycle.